Today's episode is kind of unique in that it is a follow-up episode we did with Ann Batters talking about George Orwell and his ability to take a look at what happens today and then extrapolate that into what happens in the future if we keep going down that direction. I think it's well worth delving into also the psychological impact both 1984 and Animal Farm have. I'm Serge Brown, and this is the Crash Cart Rule.
Crash Cart Rule. Crash Cart Rule.
You know, this is a podcast about life, liberty, and the pursuit of some pretty crazy stuff. So hold on to your tinfoil hat, pull up a comfy chair, and explore with me conspiracy theories, politics, weird happenings, and some plain hard-to-believe true stories. Today, we're talking with Ann Batters in our follow-up episode on George Orwell. Are we officially living in an Orwellian time? Well, yes. You really should care about how 1984 plus Animal Farm equals PRARDOX. It is time for another episode of the Crash Cart Rule. I'm Serge Brown, and we're bringing back Ann Batters, who is a not only a remarkable teacher, she spent her lifetime teaching people not only how to learn, but how to think. We're doing a follow-up episode on our Did George Orwell Predict the Future? And Orwell was a very interesting man because of his ability to take a situation and extrapolate that into the future and say, if this is happening now, this, and this could happen in the future. And it turns out with both Animal Farm and 1984, that he was extremely accurate. What say you, Ann?
Well, I don't even know if he was predicting the future or just explaining what was happening in the world at the time. Mm-hmm. I think the Cold War was the movement towards communism, and maybe it took a hiatus and now it's happening again. So it seems like he was predicting the future, but he was probably just understanding what was happening in his world.
You know, I have a theory about the Cold War and about post-World War II. We know that George Bush Sr.'s grandfather, or father rather, was a major contributor in financing the Nazi Party after World War II. Many of the Nazis, your hardcore Nazis, and I mean by the thousands, were moved out of Nazi Germany and down into South America, in particular Argentina. But thousands, tens of thousands of these very radical Nazis were moved into America, into the scientific community, into the teaching, the upper echelons of our Department of Education. And I think that Cold War, all that was a secret time that we could say Russia is the problem, take all the focus off of America and allow that socialist communist approach to then be grown literally into America. And I think that we see that with the desensitization of children at the very beginning, and now how that has manifested itself to society, just allows anything to happen. We really are not shocked by anything. And because we're not shocked, nothing is done about it.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, if we're talking about 1984, the children are desensitized by these monthly hangings.
Right.
And they're also encouraged to become child heroes. And that's sort of a propagandized vision of what they could be. And so they become these staunch followers, or not followers, but supporters and little cops, basically.
Exactly.
Reporting on their parents, reporting on anybody following people who seem suspicious, and then reporting them even if they don't really know for sure if they've had a thought crime. And what is a thought crime? A thought crime is what just a thought that doesn't support the Big Brother movement.
Right.
which was just perpetual fear, really.
And that, I think if you think, I think that that's exactly what the whole point of communism and socialism is. And we see it in capitalism. We see fear mongering in advertisement and every political, don't vote for this person. They're going to kill your grandchildren or not give you coverage for your medicine. But in particular, George Orwell really identified in both 1984 and Animal Farm, the communist approach or the Marxist approach that we had with Stalin in Animal Farm, and then the Nazi fascist socialist approach in Nazi Germany in 1984. All of that is based on fear. Create as much fear and panic in society, and don't do anything until it's too late, and then offer that solution. Oh, we got to do it right now because now it's too late. Right? We could have done anything 10 or 20 or 30 years ago, but now we have to do it right now because now it's too late. And I think that fear type of politics has destroyed not only America, but the world. And Orwell saw it in the very beginning.
He saw it. He understood the chess games. I think because he went to Spain and he started to recognize, I think once you realize that the media is lying, then you kind of go, well, why are they lying? What is their ultimate goal? And of course, it's usually to create division, to create polarity, to create this. I mean, even with the whole, when you talk about World War I, World War II, the whole development of the nation state created this patriotism and curiosity and this is our culture, these are our slogans and our songs, and this is what we believe in. And then now it's like, okay, we don't want the nation state anymore. We want globalism. So now we say, oh, that nationalism was terrible and it was bad, and that's what created the war. And you start to think, well, actually, no, I respect other cultures.
Right.
I think I love having my culture and going, oh, this is an interesting culture that you do things differently. I love it. I love traveling and seeing that. But now they're trying to say, well, the whole problem with the world was nationalism, and we need to have a globalist movement. And you start to go, well, was it really that bad? Or was it just weaponized so that we were afraid of our country being stolen by another country or turned against the Huns? And, that was World War I. What are you going to do if the Huns come knocking at your door?
Exactly.
Well, that was to create hatred towards the Germans. Once you start seeing the game, it's like, okay, you kind of know what their plan is. And so he was in a war. He knew they were lying, and then he's trying to warn us. And the thing when we look at 1984, it really begins with his character awakening to his own consciousness,
right,
and his awareness of, hey, they're lying and they're manipulating history. They're eliminating history, my history, and he starts to find his own memories. They start coming through the act of writing, which it's kind of like super powerful. It awakens him to his inner voice and his inner self. And that's a journey that takes him to a rebellious act.
And it's interesting that George Orwell took that character, Winston Smith, and he's later in life, in a time where the brain actually is coming out of that me, I need to build. By, that character is 39 and he looks 100 years old if you've ever seen the film. But he's in a mindset now that he starts to become introspective, the character.
Yes.
And it allows George Orwell to really step up that magnifying glass as to what is, first of all, happening with Winston, but then society.
So true. What happens to Winston? Winston is kind of like a microcosm of Trace.
He
what
really
they do to a nation.
We are coming up on the end of our first segment. I'm Serge Brown. This is the Crash Cart Rule. We're speaking with Ann Batters once again. We'll be back after this. We are back right here on the Crash Cart Rule. I'm Serge Brown. Hey, check us out at thecrashcartrule.com for our previous shows with Ann and with other shows that we have. When we last left, Ann, we were talking about Winston and how he was getting to a point where he started to become introspective. And he did that any number of ways. Can you explain that to our listeners, how he really found himself and how that was the basis of 1984?
Well, interestingly enough, Winston is 39 years old when he suddenly starts to awaken to that the reality is not real. And he decides that he's going to take a risk and buy a diary. So he goes to this antique store, and it's illegal to be shopping there, but everyone does to get their shoelaces. There's nothing else really that they nowhere else they can get shoelaces except for these black market.
Because in a communist and socialist society, the supply chain breaks down and black markets thrive.
So, but there's cameras everywhere. So he's aware that just the purchase of a diary is a threat. It's he feels quite guilty buying it.
Right.
These diaries haven't been produced for 40 years, and he knows that the diary he picks is even older than that. He hasn't been writing. Nobody writes anymore. They speak into these machines, and they're not speaking creative thoughts. They're just speaking, oh, I need this grocery, I need that, but they're not really using their mind to think. But so this whole idea of him purchasing the diary is this first act of his awakening. He wants to record history. He wants to record his thoughts. He wants to have a relationship with himself on the page. And so he takes this home, and he thinks that his little TV screen can't see the one corner of his room. But at the end of the story, we find out that they knew all along that he was writing in the diary, which is devastating. But anyways, well, he starts writing in the diary. He thinks he's in this corner and no one can see him. And then he hesitates before he writes because he's like, well, apparently it's April 4th, 1984. But he's like, how do I even know it's that? He's starting to think they could have lied to him about the dates. And so that's super interesting. And so this whole idea of April, a new beginning, and then he sits there and his hand's cramping up because he hasn't written for so long. And then when he finally gets this desire to write, he writes furiously. He writes without thought. It's almost like his hand is moving creatively. Like, this is what the creative people do. They say it wrote itself, like this consciousness is an awakening. It's his voice. And then he writes about sort of, we don't know if it's a memory or whether he's just being creative and making up a story, but he kind of writes about fake news, which is interesting. This how the media sets up the props and throws an arm in the air and the helicopter comes down and gets a perfect picture.
Right.
And it's just so it's an indication that he's aware that the news is fake, or whether it just all came out, and then he starts writing down with Big Brother, and he can't control himself.
And that is it is so parallel to what goes on now. Just like Roger Stone was a proponent of Donald Trump's, and the FBI, who is under incredible scrutiny now, and they should be, because they have become the Stasi, the SS of America. They're, the left uses them as the political enforcement weapon that the Nazi Party was. Well, Roger Stone, they raided his house.
Oh, Roger Stone, yeah.
Yeah, at 5 a.m, and CNN just happened to be there as they break in, as they abuse his wife, as they walk him out, or they, frog step him out. And it reminds me so much of 1984. As soon as I saw that, it was like they just took that, that part of 1984 and said, we're going to recreate this. Bang, we've got CNN in our pocket, MSNBC, all those guys, ABC, NBC, CBS. I mean, everything's propaganda. And that's why people believe that nothing's propaganda. But I'm sorry, I'm walking all over your train of thought there. As you were saying,
Well, he's quite like you're saying. When you start to realize that you're being lied to, you start to question everything. You start to question everything. He's questioning this, and in fact, he's kind of like Winston himself, because he's writing this book when he's close to death. He's dying of tuberculosis. He finds a friend that lives in Scotland, and he's just sitting down to write this book as a final warning. Don't let it happen. And that's something that he's trying to impart, question everything, people. So he is, in a way, a lot like Winston. And I must say, like at the very end of the story, after they've broken him and reprogrammed him, super sad, he has a bottle of gin, like it seems to be there's an endless supply of gin by his bedroom or at this pub that he goes to. And they're not worried about him anymore. He's no longer going to be they told him they'll eventually kill him, and that will be wonderful. He doesn't care. Yeah. But he's like saying, like, the gin now has replaced his birth, death, and rebirth, or what do you call it?
He's at the evolution.
Yeah, sort of a rebirth.
Exactly.
Yeah, so he's saying, like, he passes out with the gin. It's his death, and then it's his rebirth in the morning. It's his only thing that can keep him going, just to have a drink in the morning, and then and he drinks throughout the day. And that's what just really got me. I thought that was so sad. He turns into an alcoholic. So, but at the very beginning, it's the birth of Winston, when he starts to awaken to his own mind. And then as he awakens to his own mind, he is visited by memories of his mother, memories of his sister. And that's something where he starts to realize that these memories that he has, especially he remembers his disappearance of his mother and the death of his sister. And he says something like, it was a sorrowful tragedy that he knows does not exist anymore. It's impossible to have that kind of feeling.
I agree.
Gone.
The part is that they need to dismantle somebody so they don't become a threat. And I think that one of the ways they do that is by creating a society of true believers. And we're going to talk about true believers when we come back. This is the Crash Cart Rule. I'm Serge Brown. We'll be back after this. Now, if you're just joining us right here on the Crash Cart Rule, I know a lot of you listen on the podcast as well, but if you're on the radio listening, we are talking with Ann Batters, and we were just talking about Winston and 1984 and how they broke him, but the way that you break a society. And Winston it's not just Winston when you're reading the book 1984, and it's not just Boxer when you're reading Animal Farm, but those characters are designed to show you how a portion of society is dealt with, not just a single person. And I had mentioned as we left the last segment about the way that they accomplish that is by creating early on true believers. And in 1984, you have true believers, but it really starts with the book Animal Farm that George Orwell wrote. And how long before was it? About 15 years before he wrote, probably even longer than that, 17 years or so before he wrote 1984, he wrote Animal Farm. And
I don't even think that it was maybe 10 years. I don't know.
Oh, okay.
I can't remember what year Animal Farm was written, but it wasn't. It was probably after the Spanish Civil War, so it would have been probably 1940, I think.
Okay.
I think you probably, and I'm not sure. We could look it up, but it is interesting. Like, you talk about the true believers and how they're created, and oftentimes it's with flattery or just people feeling that they have a purpose, and we said, like, Boxer was a favorite character, and most people can identify with him or know someone like him. And he was the hard worker. He got up early to work. He believed in his ability to contribute to society. and didn't mind getting up 2 hours early to work on the farm before anyone else.
Exactly. And
but the thing is,
just in case no one has read Animal Farm, it's unlike having a real human being in 1984, which you should read as well, the people listening. But Animal Farm is symbolic because the reason it's called Animal Farm is why, Anne?
Well, the animals were rebelling against a human farmer, which was, supposed to be the czar, but it was Farmer Jones, and they believed that they were being used
Exactly.
to they were doing all the work and he was reaping all the benefits. So they were inspired by Marx, or the indoctrination of the Marxist ideas. But when we read Orwell's 1984, he says that no revolution is spontaneous. It's all planned by someone who wants to shift the way the world is moving.
Mm-hmm.
So he didn't realize the animals just got used to create, to basically enslave themselves, because they started to recognize once they had, once the revolution had subsided and they were now supposedly owners of their land, they started to think, oh, we're hungrier than we've ever been. Things were better before, actually, when Farmer Joe. But then they get lied to. They get spun this, it's statistics and you're eating better and this and that. But
exactly.
They also change history too. Like Boxer, he was at the front fighting. He was like a soldier. He was fighting alongside Snowball. But then after, years later, when Snowball's chased off, Napoleon changed the history and said it was Napoleon that was fighting. Well, Napoleon wasn't even in the war. And poor Boxer remembered, and he brought it up, and he said, look, I remember fighting with Snowball. I remember he got injured. And then suddenly Napoleon sticks the dogs on him, but he doesn't realize Napoleon is doing that because he keeps thinking, well, Napoleon's always right.
Right.
He has, like you said, he has that maxim. So he tells himself that he's not seeing things. He's not seeing things correctly, and he becomes confused. And then when Napoleon says, "No, it was me," he goes, "Oh, I guess so." And Napoleon's always right. So here he's experiencing cognitive dissonance. He's on the precipice of waking up, and he really doesn't wake up until he's been injured. Mm-hmm. He's injured his leg. And Napoleon, they're going to say, well, he's now a useless eater. He's not going to help us at all. And we don't want him to retire because he's just going. So they call they basically have the glue factory come and pick him up. And that's when Benjamin the donkey, who's been quiet the whole time, because he says donkeys live a long time. He's super wise, and he doesn't. He's unaware. He's this kind of person that's aware of what's going on, but there's really no point in speaking because the people are all caught up in this revolution or the building of a windmill. They're building windmills.
Right.
And anyway, so he doesn't say much, but the minute they're taking Boxer and he sees what he can read on the side of the truck that the knackers, they're taking him, he knows, he starts shouting and yelling and chasing, and we've never seen anything out of Benjamin the donkey, and now he's completely awake.
Right.
But one thing about Boxer is when he dies or when he disappears, they don't have a funeral for him. They just forget. They conveniently forget about him. Because to remember him is to remember that moment that he died, and they started to probably see the truth, but they decide to go back into pretending that they don't remember.
Exactly.
And they don't talk about him, they don't have a funeral for him, and their lives are just perpetual agony, and they decide to bury their heads in the sand.
Don't you find it so incredible? First of all, Boxer needs to be told by Benjamin and Clover of his fate. He, even at the very end, even when he can see it coming at him, that all of his work is worth nothing, that he was that true believer. And he is this big, powerful workhorse. Pardon me. And he was looking forward to retirement. He was promised it.
It promised it, and he worked hard for it. But he wasn't going to get it because he was never going to be a useless eater, with the way they didn't use that word, but that basically how they looked at him. They sold him, and they got a bunch of booze, the animals, and at the very end of the story, the other animals peer in because they can hear this whooping laughter coming from the house, and they look in and they see the other farmers sitting around with the pigs, and they can't decipher between the animals or between the pigs and the farmers. They can't tell the difference.
Right.
And we know that it's probably Churchill and FDR sitting there,
mm-hmm.
and they're actually admitting their admiration for Napoleon. If they first said, we're really surprised that you were successful with this farm. They were hoping that he would not be successful and that they could probably take over Russia and they could share the spoils. The farmers could share the spoils. Right. But they admit, they're like, wow, we're really impressed that you're able to demand such loyalty from your animals, that they work so hard for such little sustenance. That's what they said. And that's an eerie ending to that story, because that tells us that Orwell was suspicious of FDR and Churchill.
And he should be.
Because that's what they had. That's how. Of course he should be. But most of us go back. Oh yeah, FDR is a hero, and he was a great guy. But you know what? He brought them into the Depression for 10 years.
Yeah,
I mean, we have to question everything.
And FDR took away so many rights. He had the New Deal, and now we have the new Green Deal, and they're almost exactly the same. It's all about stripping rights under the guise of we've created a problem, but now we're going to solve that problem for the greater good.
For the greater good, yeah.
And that greater good is what Boxer and everybody on Animal Farm worked so hard for. And all of a sudden you realize
they just got used.
Yep.
Just used.
And the leaders, they're not that different. It reminds me, we have two different books in 1984 and in Animal Farm, but the structure of those books are very much alike. And in both of those, we see how famine is used. And we know that the leaders of the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Health Order, they have been caught on tape saying starving people are necessary. They work harder, right? And so it's not hard to believe that that's part of the plan. And George Orwell, he saw that. It's been of course 70 years.
Yeah, of course he saw that. Well, I mean, same with Mao, and he wrote that 1984 and in 1948 and 49, and Mao was starving his people. So, and of course, he sets Animal Farm up on a farm, and the kulaks were the farmers, and there was a hate campaign to turn the peasants against the farmers, so that they would blame the farmers for because the farmers had more land than they owned some land, and the farmers were like, you know what, we don't really believe in this collectivization, and we don't really want to give up our farms. And I mean, they were modest farms. These kulaks had modest farms. They had one or two workers, but they were targeted.
Yep.
Just like the wealthy class were targeted and blamed, and they turned the young people, the students who don't own anything yet, against the wealthy class, and they say that they're to blame, but the bankers are hiding behind, and they're going to just confiscate the land that the landowners had. They just want their land, and then they're going to say, well, it's because no one should own land, and then basically they reinstate the hierarchy, and then just different people become the wealthy class. There was a 3-class system, the middle class and the upper class, and it's just a different upper class. It's just switching the upper class. But,
and what we're seeing is the destruction of middle class, to the point that we are going to be very much like every other society. We're seeing both the Chinese, Bill Gates, and any number of other government entities buying up massive parts of farmland. Yeah. We're seeing water being turned off to independent farmers. We're seeing the supply chain purposely broken so they don't have the ability to farm, and everything's being pushed into these quote government farms that are not really government farms. They're owned by a few people, but we, the people, we still have to pay. First of all, we pay our tax dollars in order for that to be part of the evolution of that farm, and then we have to pay to get everything out of that in higher taxes. It's just crazy. We're going to talk more about this when we come back. Make sure you check out thecrashcartrule.com. I'm Serge Brown. We're speaking with Ann Batters, and we're going to be back in just about 2 minutes. We are back right here at the Crash Cart Rule. I'm Serge Brown, and we are speaking with Ann Batters about the George Orwell's 1984 and Animal Farm, 2 remarkable books. They should be on your bucket list. And if you haven't watched the films or read the books, I thoroughly encourage you to do so, because they really depict the framework, the structures of what happened in the book and how it aligns with what is going on today. And when we left, we were talking about how the overthrow of farms is happening and the supply chain is being purposely destroyed. And we're also seeing how they are buying up all this land, moving people out of the rural areas and into these high density, suburbs and cities, where then they can even control somebody more, take away their space, take away their freedom, watch them 24/7. And Winston, it reminds me of when Benjamin woke up with Boxer, right? Benjamin was pretty much always awake. He was always skeptical of what was going on in Animal Farm. And then Winston, we have this awakening of Winston, and then he meets Julia as well. And that relationship, the dynamic of that is extremely important in understanding how those different parts of thought come about.
Well, Julia is like Benjamin. She's been awake for a long time. Mm-hmm. She is, but she's so clever. She's not only is she pretends to be the staunch, fervent supporter of the party. She volunteers for everything, but she's cunning and she's pragmatic, and she refuses to not have a happy life, to not enjoy herself. And when Winston wakes up, she recognizes it in him because it's in her. So she sees that he's awake, but he's still not completely awake because he can't see that she's just pretending. She's falling for him because he's not like he's attractive. He's 10 years older than her or more. She's 26, he's 39 or something like that. And he's not an attractive man, but what she does see in him is someone who's alive because someone's waking up. He's not in this hypnotic state.
Right. At that point, it's just very attractive to her.
It is. It's attractive. When you see someone who's awake, you just feel like you can talk to them. You can connect with them. So she sees that in him, and she hands him a little slip. Sure, this is after their 2 minutes of hate, which is fascinating too. Mm-hmm. Every day they have this 2 minutes of hate, and she hands him this little slip, says, "I love you," and he was shocked because he thought she was hating her. He was thinking, "Look at this girl; she's so beautiful, and she's wearing this sash about virginity sash,
right? And
she's not a virgin. She's organizes a meeting place later when they have an opportunity to talk, but that's very difficult too because there's surveillance everywhere. Mm-hmm. They can't just openly speak, so they have to find a secret place where there are no microphones. And anyway, they carry on this relationship. They develop a love, and the book kind of slows down, and you start to see normal people, and they develop this connection until they have the secret hideout place. It ends up, it's actually in that the junk store where he bought the diary. At the very top of this one room,
Right.
he sees that there's this secret house or not, like a secret room. And they thought, well, it's got old things, and they could pretend, they can like basically play house together there. There's no telescreen, but unfortunately there was a hidden microphone, and they were being spied on the whole time, but they allowed this relationship.
I think that one of the reasons that Orwell shows us that is for people to constantly be aware. You need to control your surroundings, because if you don't, the government will. They will take away any question of freedom will be removed unless you are vigilant. And one thing that we see in 1984 is not only how Julia affects Winston's decision making and his approach, but how he, unbeknownst to him, allows her to drop her guard a little, and that is how they are caught.
Mm-hmm. And I don't know how long the relationship goes on for, but yeah, they're going to let their guard down, because she even said, when you are, when you're intimate with someone and you have love, you don't care, you rebel. Yeah. And the only people that rebel are conscious or have love in their hearts. So she's like, this is a little bit of living. I want to live. So they become rebellious, and unfortunately they do get caught, and then they get tortured so severely. It's awful. Until this is the sad part, until they betray each other. Yep. They're tortured till they betray each other. And then at the very end of the story, they're allowed to live. But when they see each other, it's not the same.
And is George Orwell...
You've experienced that.
Is Orwell saying that is, yes, they are alive, but they no longer get to live?
They don't get to love.
Nope.
They don't. And even when Winston has some memories still, he tells himself that they're not real memories, that he's making them up. Mm-hmm. It's just sad. And then he just drinks every day, and that's devastating to me. I found the end really sad.
And they say that the average Russian dies around 40 years old because they drink themselves to death from day one. And I think that we see that in Orwell's story on Winston it's frighteningly realistic in how people do that exact same behavior when all of a sudden everything is taken away from them. Even the people that aren't aware, they will drink themselves.
Well, that's, when you talk about people drinking, he stopped drinking when he was in love with Julia.
Yep.
He didn't have the need to drink. The thing is, what's super interesting about the two of them is she's been awake for a long time, so she's super clever. She's super cunning. She's able to find ways to get real coffee and real chocolate. Mm-hmm. So she has her way of getting things. Whereas he's just like enjoying his memories coming back. He's starting to think for himself, and he's experiencing joy for the first time, and love. And so, but in his discussions with her, when they start talking, they realize how different they are. And he's still like this idealist, and this is Orwell again talking. And what does he say? I wrote down this quote. Okay. Oh, he starts to. So when he starts to experience his own consciousness and love, he starts to look at the proles differently. He's like, I don't know why I ever hated them. Like, he starts to feel love for them. And he starts to recognize that they never stop being human. He starts to realize that they touch each other, they hug each other, they sing. There's some love there. But they've kind of been left because the middle class, he's supposed to be, he's the inner part, or he's the outer party. And so they're just kind of living in these, the squalor, really. They're living in these dirty apartments.
Mm-hmm.
He's assaulted by different odors. And it's interesting because that's when these apartments, the flats or whatever, were first built, was post-World War II. So this is interesting. They started building these apartments. They put people in close quarters, took them off the farms then. And this is, again, like you said, what they're doing right now. But he starts to think that the only hope is going to be 1,000 years before enough people wake up. And it's really reliant on the proles because they're the only ones that are real human beings. Because we're not human. He starts to think that we're not human. And then he says something. I got to read this quote. I don't imagine that we can alter anything in our lifetime. But one can imagine little knots of resistance springing up here and there, small groups of people banding themselves together, leaving behind records so the next generations can carry on where they left off. I'm like, oh, that's Orwell talking for sure. You know, he's trying to say, this is my little book, and my book here is just a little pocket that we need to be vigilant and to be awake because we don't want to ever lose our ability to think for ourselves. And he's to start recognizing it's a war on your mind. It's a war on your thoughts. So
it certainly is. You know, the question I have though in 1984 is here you have Winston, who's gone through this massive change through the entire novel. And rather than killing him at the end, they reprogram him and they keep him alive. But to what end?
Yeah. Well, there is a dialogue between him and one particular man who he thought was on his side. But the man, I don't know why he decides to torture him and reprogram him. I think he was almost envious of him. But he says something like, we cannot allow a thought to exist, no matter where it is.
Make an example of him.
Well, I think it's about consciousness. Mm-hmm. So he's trying to say that if we allow a thought to exist, he started to notice that throughout history, when people kill someone who is still standing in their belief, that they become a martyr. So we can't have any martyrs,
right?
Because we want people to vanish. We'll have to kill them and they'll vanish. But before we allow them to vanish, we need to destroy their dignity, destroy their free thought, because those thoughts, even if the person dies with those thoughts, he's just kind of saying that's a consciousness, and the consciousness doesn't die. I think Orwell's trying to say that consciousness exists in the ether. It's kind of like Carl Jung, you know. Yep. It's like the collective consciousness. So we have to destroy your consciousness before we kill you.
And it is the 100th monkey effect.
It is the 100th. I heard you talk about that in one of your programs.
Right.
And that's what I thought too. I thought it's exactly that. And so the more people if you're around people that are conscious, then there's more likelihood that people will wake up too. Exactly. I mean, you can see it happening. So they have to destroy one's ability to think.
Exactly. And if they destroy that one's ability to think, and another and another and another, does that bleed into the consciousness of society, that central stream of consciousness? And it tells people, don't step out of line. Are they using that etherical method to also control people? Because we know that Hitler was huge. The Third Reich was huge on superstition or artifacts, anything that had to do with the occult. They really chased that down. Did they understand something that we didn't?
They did.
That Orwell understood as well.
Well, they did. I mean, it goes right back to, like I said, Julius Caesar, when we talked about that in our last podcast. People are used as little weapons. They turn the people into little soldiers, and they do that through hatred. That's what the 2 minutes of hate was all about. If you have this hate in your heart, it blinds you from being able to see it creates this, and the hate can be channeled. This is fascinating because Orwell didn't hate anybody, but he said it was so hard not to get caught up in this hatred. It was almost like a religion of hate instead of love. You know, so even the Ministry of Love. Sorry.
Go ahead.
They said like everything was the opposite. So in the Ministry of Love was about pushing hatred. So you had this hatred, and he said even though people were projecting their hatred onto this supposed rebellious character that was creating a movement, which is also super fascinating. Whether that's true or not, we don't know, or whether this was a fictional character. Anyways, he said, I kind of liked what he was saying because he was a free thinker, but I still got caught up in the hate. And it was interesting how the hatred could deflect onto anybody else. So as soon as you have hate in your heart, it can be pushed onto anybody else. And I thought, well, that's super interesting. That's a little bit of psychology that I think Orwell is aware of. And obviously he's aware that that's
and it's being used. Look at what happened in Ottawa with the truckers. Look at what's happened in with the farmers over in, I can't remember the name.
In the Netherlands.
In the Netherlands. Thank you. I keep wanting to say Newfoundland. Farmers over in the Netherlands, hatred. And look at what has happened. Look at how they allow groups in America like Antifa and Black Lives Matter and the LGBTQ. Right? I don't care who you love, but when they weaponize that approach, that creates that hatred.
Yeah. Well, hatred is not natural. It's not natural, so it has to be taught.
Right.
Love is natural. So you have to teach people to hate if you want them to be little weapons. You want them to be little soldiers. They need to hate somebody or fear some threat. Oh, they're going to come and invade your country. Or, I mean, we've been programmed to hate Russians forever.
We have.
Like forever. Through the movies, through the TV. We're programmed to hate Chinese people. We're programmed to hate, they're a threat to your country. And why do we want to hate anybody?
Right.
I don't know.
And when the real threat is the government, those few people that spend generations in power, that's the real threat. And what they're doing is they're just saying, don't look at us. Look, those people. Right. I mean, that's why the Jews were picked. Hitler hated the Jews. It was convenient. They had some personality traits that he thought.
That's interesting too.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's in 1984 as well, where people don't know their background. They don't know their history. They don't know their stories because they're constantly, throughout history, all of these people become like displaced. They're displaced from their land, their culture. And the culture is not a weapon. And just like Mao had destroyed a culture, an ancient culture, Chinese culture,
he certainly
was destroyed in such a short time. And so when people don't know their culture and they don't know their history, then they feel a little bit lost. And
they feel lost. Unfortunately, we have lost time. This has been the Crash Cart Rule, and thank you very much.
Thank you. That was fun.
And we'll see you next time.